concept of investment that recognizes the importance of the care economy, of healthcare, education, in producing and maintaining the human beings who produce things, goods and services. So what I do in the chapter is I basically rework the official data from 2019. It was the last year before the pandemic. And so at the time I was writing, it was the best set of data to use. And basically, in the official data, business investment is 84% of all of the investment. Government is 16%. When I redid the numbers, dividing it between business, government, and community, which is households plus nonprofits, it ended up that the business community, that business is responsible for less than 30% of all of the investment. And that's with a very conservative estimate of the value of the household labor to raise children, very conservative estimates of the cost of education, skill training, and so forth. So the end point of that is that all of the arguments that we're familiar with for austerity, the reason that we can't afford to have good things, we can't give you higher wages, we can't have more government spending, that argument is always because we have to make sure that the profit share of national income is large enough to finance the investments, that they're the goose that lays the golden egg. Everybody else has to sacrifice so that profits will be high enough that they can finance the new investment that maintains our prosperity. But when they're responsible, when business is responsible for less than 30% of all of the productive investment in the economy, then that argument is precisely and totally wrong. I mean, it's an argument that we should be, in fact, giving households more money, giving the public sector more money so that they can make the critical investments like educating our children, providing quality health care, that is what makes the labor force productive, and that reorganizing the investment flows is essential to transitioning from a habitation economy to a habitation society.
Right. Okay. Yeah. I mean, I've seen other interrogations of other concepts, like GDP gets interrogated regularly for all the misleading work that the concept does. But I haven't seen investment used quite that way. But the other thing that comes to mind is when we think about our economy, we think about household consumption as a drain on the economy, and you're reconfiguring it as, well, most of that is probably investment. It's not just consumption, or a lot of it is investment, and therefore this is something that drives the production of other firms or something like that. In this case, you're talking about how households are almost an autonomous source of decision-making, allocation of capital, so on like that, and therefore warrant support, not draining.
Right, and this is, I mean, an argument that feminist theorists have been making for a while, that there's production and there's reproduction. There's producing the human beings that are a key input into the economy. And because economics was constructed by men in a patriarchal time, production was always privileged. Reproduction was largely ignored because it was dominated by women. And what I'm trying to do is to say that if we take reproduction seriously, we can see investment, productive activity. And the simple reality is that production is dependent on reproduction. I mean, and it was a fundamental insight that makes us change the way we think about the economy.
Certainly. In a way, the idea of rethinking investment is helpful because it doesn't require the separation of production and reproduction as two different things, whichever much you want to elevate reproduction, it doesn't sound equivalent. Whereas what you're really doing is you're just sort of leveling the playing field between these sectors in terms of their importance for our economy, but also our well-being, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Uh, one interesting piece that I liked in this was when in that chapter, you're also looking at a lot of poll numbers and, I imagine if Polanyi were around, he would be excited about this. But, a lot of the things that people are really upset about in the United States are these underinvested sectors that we all rely upon tremendously. So why don't you give us some examples of that? I mean, some of them are pretty straightforward, but.
Right. So at one point, I say that our habitation is lacking, and so what evidence do I have for people being dissatisfied with their habitation? And so in polling data, people say there's not enough funding for mass transit. Traffic is terrible where I live. I live too far from amenities, stores, parks, and so forth. The most obvious example is the problem of housing affordability, which is a crisis, globally at this point, but it's particularly acute in the United States, where we haven't been producing new housing that is affordable for decades now. So in the polling data, large majorities are upset about housing affordability. Parents recognize that their children can't afford to purchase houses in the neighborhoods where they grew up and so forth. So, I want to stress that to me, part of the power of the habitation concept is that it brings the climate crisis and issues of environmental justice kind of into the center. I mean, so it's housing, it's climate, it's environmental justice, it's the quality of the services that we get at the local level, the education, the policing, the healthcare. These are the issues that concern people, and yet we haven't found much of a way within our politics, as they're currently constructed, to make those issues central, to find ways in which people can do something about them.
Well, and another one I just want to mention is healthcare,
Right.
which is another big one of these, right?
Right.
And I'm just thinking about how upset everybody is about the cost of living, and that got defined in terms of the cost of eggs. But I imagine that actually people are thinking about a lot of things beyond eggs.
Right. And we know from the reaction to the assassination of the United Healthcare guy that anger about the cost of health and the failure of private health insurance is, very central to people's concern.
So, this sort of conceptual apparatus and theoretical apparatus you set up allows us to really have a very different perspective on what you're defining as habitation, which is a couple of things. One is the Habitation Society, which you want to get us towards, but the other is that it's a sector of the economy that's kind of unrecognized. You invoke Kuhn actually in thinking about why we're so blinded to this, and talking about how you talk about how people are invested in defending a paradigm, not actually describing the world as it is basically the argument here. But you've been interrogating these economic ideas and concepts for a long time. Been very critical of neoclassical economists, and use people like Polanyi to do so. But maybe you can tell us a little bit about how you see this paradigm defense, just the main ways that it operates, and two, why we have such difficulty in moving beyond it institutionally.
So, um, so you're asking why the paradigm shift is so difficult? Is
Well, partially, but also like, what is happening? I mean, so I think, it's possible to have the idea that once we have a clear idea of how this works, we'll easily shift to a new institutional set of institutions and concepts and paradigms. But, I mean, you've kind of been waging this battle for a long time. I don't know that we're farther along down this path than we were when you started, at least in terms of the dominant framework for this. But yeah, why don't you tell us a little about why that's so hard?
well, I mean, I think that what what happens in a period of transition, like the one that we've been going through, is that it's harder and harder to make sense of things within the old paradigm, but that until the new paradigm becomes broadly accepted and understood, people are left kind of mystified. And so their understanding of how they fit into the economy, how they fit into the society, becomes kind of confused. And so that's kind of the seed, the ground in which the disinformation and authoritarian and ideas take hold. I mean, so kind of one of the ideas that has become powerful in our society that helps pave the way to MAGA's strength is a kind of everyday libertarianism. I mean, that people say, I earned my living by the sweat of my brow, and now the government comes and they want to take, 25% or 15% of what I took. And that's not fair because I worked so hard to do this. And what those people are evoking in that rhetoric, is images from Jeffersonian America where people were farmers and artisans and shopkeepers, and they were working for 70, 80 hours a week, and almost everything that they produced came from their own personal labor. But that's not the nature of work today. I mean, that we all work in, or not all of us, but almost all of us work in complex interdependent settings where the fruit of our labor is kind of very difficult to see in any kind of concrete way. I mean, that many of us, it's 10 emails and 6 short documents and 5 phone calls, and that's a work day. And so basically, the idea is that when people don't have a theoretical framework, a map that relates how they fit into the economy, they fall back on these mythical ideas, like the everyday libertarianism, and they're then willing to listen to outlandish ideas, like Trump claiming that tariffs will bring back manufacturing and people will be marching off to jobs in giant steel plants that have shifts of 20, 30,000 people producing vast amounts of steel. It's not going to happen. It's not. It has nothing to do with the reality that we're actually in.
Yeah, and it seems like a lot of the premise of the book is to make things that are true clearer in the hope that this can help. Well, I mean, really what you're trying to do is you're trying to you're trying to arm critics of the way we think about this, but also critics of the economy that we're in, or the political economy that we're in, with a paradigm, right? And in that sense, I was just thinking about the very basic transition from the idea of a post-industrial society, which, as with all posts, is flawed because it doesn't define well. That's totally in relationship to what you're saying happened before, but we don't really know what this is. And now we have a name, which is Habitation Society. And the idea is to really give a empirical and theoretical and conceptual grounding for that paradigm, right? With that in mind, I do have a couple of political questions. But first, before we get to that, I want to ask you questions about two of the sources that you really rely on a lot. One is, both of them are sources that you've been interrogating for a long time. But one is Karl Polanyi, and the other is Daniel Bell. Karl Polanyi is probably more popular these days in our professional circles than Daniel Bell, although I share your interest in Daniel Bell. But maybe you can talk a little bit about those two as intellectual resources for developing this kind of paradigm.
Well, okay, so I think that this also kind of goes back to that last question. That in my mind, the kind of original sin of mainstream economics, of neoclassical economics, is its belief that the nature of production doesn't matter. We have these charts and graphs and supply and demand curves. And so that a former chair of the Council of Economic Advisors is alleged to have said at one point, potato chips, computer chips, $100 of one is equal to $100 of the other.
Right.
Doesn't matter what the economy produces. We have a framework which tells you how to maximize output given the inputs that you have. And to my mind, that's the original sin, because the nature of what you produce requires different economic institutions. You can't run a productive agricultural economy, with the rules of an industrial economy, and vice versa. And so that's a good part of why we got into the problems that we're having. So Daniel Bell, I should say, he was my teacher as an undergraduate, although I think the book, The Coming of Post-Industrial Society, didn't appear until the 70s after I had graduated. But Bell accurately argued that computerization and the increasing role of science and technology in the production process was creating a different kind of society. It was one in which the universities were going to be more central as productive units, as that the Trump administration notwithstanding, that the research being done in the sciences is absolutely essential to technological advances and so forth. Bell was emphasizing the increasingly important economic role of science and technology, the centrality of computers and computerization, the increasing role of higher education. So on all of these things, he was completely accurate as a forecaster. The problem was that he tended towards a kind of technological optimism that this transition would occur relatively smoothly. There would be hiccups and disruptions, but people would get the idea. And Polanyi, in contrast, was a theorist of disruption, of historical moments when societies couldn't make a transition. He recognized how deeply conflictual these kind of moments of transition were. So putting the two together gets you this notion of a sustained period of conflict and tension as society struggles to make this transition. And it's here that I bring in Gramsci, the Italian Marxist theorist, who in his famous quote, basically says that the crisis consists of the old dying and the new cannot be born, and all kinds of morbid symptoms appear. So he was analyzing the rise of fascism as resulting from the society's inability to make a transition from one form of society to another. And I'm picking up on that idea, our society's inability to transition to a habitation society is the seedbed for MAGA, for the authoritarian threat. And again, it's not just limited to the US. I mean, that this problem of transition, characterizes all of the developed market societies, and they're all, struggling with authoritarian right-wing movements and tendencies at this point.
So, I was interested in the way that you talk very clearly about what you're drawing from Bell and what you thought was very prescient about his writing, and I agree. But the one part you left out was the part that I actually thought in some ways was most relevant, and you've kind of supplanted with the Gramscian Polanyian interpretation, which is his class analysis of the post-industrial society, which sees it as being a struggle between the educated and the uneducated, or the experts and the non-experts. So, he postulates that if this doesn't work out, it's going to be because of a populist reaction to expertise, right? And why do you see that as not a good interpretation of the politics of the moment in comparison to the Gramsci-Polanyi interpretation?
Well, no, I mean, obviously, our politics have polarized to some significant degree around the divide between college educated and non-college educated. I guess guess I don't emphasize that because I don't like the kind of argument that some on the left embrace. I mean, that the professional managerial class, that the college educated are all, basically have different class interests from working class people who work in factories or, are orderlies in hospitals. I don't see that there's inherently a class or an economic divide, and essentially the reason that I don't see that is the way in which our politics work. I mean, our urban areas, which include large numbers of college educated workers as well as large numbers of blue collar workers, tend to vote heavily Democratic. I mean, and so a part of what I'm trying to get at with the habitation concept is that there's a possibility of building political coalitions that extend across these polarized lines if we can find the correct way in which to direct the strategy, the correct way to define the line between those who have solidaristic relations and those who are exploiting us. And so a part of, so I guess one of the ways of getting at this is that while I'm trying to kind of focus on the possibilities and politics at the local level of rebuilding our habitation, whether it's a city, a suburb, a small town, a rural area, I recognize that our local politics has been eviscerated. And it's been eviscerated because of fiscal crisis for the last 40 years, that there are too few resources, whether it's a small town or a rural area or a big city. There's perpetual fiscal crisis. And what that perpetual fiscal crisis means is that city politics become a war of all against all. That if I want to get my neighborhood to have a better school, or transit lines that get people into downtown quicker, I'm fighting against every other neighborhood which wants their improvements. And so the consequence of that is that zero-sum politics degenerates quickly into very unpleasant fighting. Nobody wants to go to a city council meeting, that they're whatever the city. I mean, they're horrible. I mean, so my argument is that if we could overcome the fiscal crisis side of things, if we could redirect resources from the federal government back to cities and states and local governments, and expand the capacity of those local levels of government to borrow, to build infrastructure, to build affordable housing, we could transform that local politics into what it was always supposed to be, which was a laboratory for democracy, a way in which people learned how to govern themselves, something which has been totally lost and is absolutely central to the authoritarian threat, which is that people hate politics. They don't understand how it works. But if we could revive our local politics by putting resources into local areas, we could teach people once again how to govern themselves, and that would translate into the ability to hold their legislators responsible at the national level. So, that's a long way around, that. So in building these kind of coalitions, that both the rich neighborhoods and the poor neighborhoods, when resources are available, it's possible to imagine win-win plans where, they both get resources, with the poor neighborhood getting somewhat more resources because they need them more. Oh, why does that happen always?
So while Fred is taking his call, I'll just remind everybody that we're going to take some questions from people in the chat. So if you have questions, please put them in. We will pose them to Fred. We'll probably start doing that in about 5 minutes or 3 minutes. So yeah, please let us know if you have questions for Fred about Habitation Society. So, on that theme, this is part of why you're interested. So decentralization is clearly a big theme of yours. And, there are institutional experiments that you obviously like participatory budgeting and things like this. So this can engage people. It can be a political classroom. It can be an institutional test bed. It can do all of these kinds of things. So you're not trying to macro-manage what this society is supposed to look like. There are principles, though, that you see as necessarily operating, like decentralization, like, greater recognition for the types of investments that actually make the economy work and things like that. Yeah.
Right. And a part of the point is that that I emphasize inclusion and egalitarian policies in part because that the inequality, at the local level, forcing people to live on the streets, forcing huge class differences, it essentially makes our cities more dangerous, more unsightly, more unpleasant. And so there is a common interest in providing a much more effective safety net, much greater access to the basic necessities of housing and healthcare and education.
Okay. So, I want to, this is the last question that I'm going to ask about the politics, but I'm thinking of somebody else who's a friend of our center here in Tempe, Adam Greenfield, who recently published a book called Lifehouse, which in some ways argues for similar things, but it's not, the assumption behind it is that it's already too late and that there is no functioning sort of national politics. And what he's describing, or what he's riffing off of, is the move towards communal autarky. And you can see that some in movement spaces. You can see it in things like the Rojava experiment. You can see it in, in the Zapatista experiment. You can see it in these kinds of things where the effort isn't to sort of change how a national polity works. It's we're checking out, we're creating our life house that'll enable us to hopefully survive the catastrophe that's coming. And, he's also interested in obviously decentralization, empowering communities, these kinds of things. But it's a much more dystopian vision of the future. So if Adam Greenfield were in my seat, what would you say to him that would say, it's too early for that, maybe, we still have to be here and thinking about this paradigm shift?
Well, I think that, that there's a common source, that we saw during COVID. I mean, that most of the workforce stayed home, and we were dependent upon those 10 or 15% who were the essential workers who stocked the supermarket and the hospitals and delivered the food to our houses. What that made clear, one of the kind of old arguments, against the post-industrial theorists were people who, said we can't really have a service economy, where everybody takes in each other's laundry. I mean, and the reality is that we do have a service economy where we each take in every other person's laundry. I mean, that's the reality, that 90% of what we consume is produced locally. So that's the common core, I think, is a recognition that the reality is more locally based. So that makes me optimistic that if we could, from the bottom up, take advantage of that, we could restructure the whole thing before it's too late, before we're overcome by climate crisis and macroeconomic breakdown and so forth. I mean, that that I think we still want to have, foreign trade and, be able to consume things that are being produced on the other side of the world and so forth. But that's a relatively small part of what we need to survive on a day-to-day basis.
Right. Hence why another reason why tariffs can't solve all of our problems. Even if we made all that locally, it's still not really most of what we need.
Right.
Okay. We are going to turn to a question, and we will start with Ben Fong, who is a Barrett professor here at ASU, and he is also the associate director of the Center for Work and Democracy. Ben Fong this is his question. Many accounts of what's required to decarbonize involve some degree of reindustrialization to produce EVs, solar panels, offshore wind turbines, etc. The habitation concept moves us beyond the terms of industrial society, but how definitively do you think we need to transcend those terms, given the need for renewed industrial production today for the purpose of greening and infrastructural renewal?
Well, okay, so I don't see any kind of fundamental tension between moving towards a habitation society and manufacturing the things that we need, like the solar panels and the wind turbines and so forth. And in fact, a part of um, the kind of background to this thinking um, has been the work that I've done on innovation policy, and that basically in the Biden administration, um, they became quite explicit that their model of regional economic development, of building up the economic capacity of regions, was by um, building regional innovation ecosystems. And so they were directing the flow of federal monies, essentially, um, many of which were focused on climate change, um, at building up these capacity at the local level, which meant getting universities, community colleges, manufacturing firms, local government, state government to work together to build the capacity to develop um, a particular kind of industrial product in a particular place. So I saw that um, in terms of innovation policy, it was moving in the same direction of the kind of focusing on this local subnational capacity. Um, as so, I saw that as fitting with the focus on the bottom up development of towns, cities, and so forth. The two, I think, are quite consistent. Um, that we need to do both. In other words, that I said before that 90%, maybe that's too high, 80% of what we produce is produced locally, but each of these communities has to produce some things which they can sell outward to pay for the things that they need to import. And so that leads to developing these specialties around technological, advanced manufacturing products and so forth. So I see a lot of consistency in those lines of argument.
And I assume that, having a better idea, for example, of what investment means doesn't necessarily handicap how you would measure the performance of an industrial firm, right? I mean, there's no necessary contradiction there.
Right. And one of the lines of argument that I make in the book that we haven't addressed is that I argue a part of one of the key reasons that we haven't been able to make this transition is that we're continuing to privilege the giant industrial firms that emerged in the industrial era to produce standardized products. And they were really good at that. I mean, that, like the big auto companies and so forth. The problem is that those same giant industrial firms are not particularly good in innovation. They're not particularly good at producing destandardized products in creative ways. A lot of the dynamism in the economy is coming from the smaller firms, from the startups, that the government funded Tesla at the beginning precisely because the big three weren't willing to make the investments needed to produce an electric car. That's how Elon made his fortune. So the argument is that in the future we need to have an economy that's built on small and medium-sized manufacturing firms, because those are the firms that are most productive and most innovative. And again, that reinforces the more local-oriented vision of how economic development moves forward.
Okay. So I'll just remind everybody, if you have questions, we have a few more minutes. If you have questions for Fred Block on the Habitation Society, please put them in the Q&A. So we will now turn to Benjamin Case, who is a research assistant professor here in the School of Social and Family Dynamics and an affiliate of the Center for Work and Democracy. Ben Case says, thank you for the talk. As you said, Trump promises to, it's another industry question. Trump's promises to bring back major industry are unlikely to work out for the majority of people. But what makes those promises appealing to working people in the paradigm of a habitation society? Is this a longing to leave habitation society behind for an industrial society, or is it some imagined synthesis where people have the lifestyle of a habitation society fueled by good industrial jobs?
Well, I think it's the latter. I mean that we know that um, across the Midwest, when the factories closed down or moved to Mexico, that in many cases the remaining jobs in town were Walmart jobs. So people experienced a fairly significant drop in their standard of living. So that um, what I'm arguing is that the tariffs are not going to bring back the plants that closed down and the wage levels they provided. What we need instead is to expand and improve the jobs in the service sector that are there, the jobs in healthcare and education and universities. Um, but we also can have a dynamic technology sector that's also producing jobs that are paid well, that then further expand the service sector of the economy.
Okay. All right. I think that I have one last question, which is you sort of set up the economy as having these different sectors, and we use different concepts, theories, and so on to understand them. And in different paradigms are going to elevate or de-emphasize different aspects of this, right? There's an idea of the industrial economy as one which is organized around private firms, and it produces products, commodities that are useful and that people pay for, and so on like that. But you're a little bit light touch with sort of the developments since the industrial era ended, and we have not gotten to the habitation society. So things like financialization, right? Things like tech, sort of, which could be interpreted a lot of different ways. But thinking about Polanyi, one way to think about the role of the habitation society, or that not the habitation society, but the habitation economy, is one that is providing fuel and resources for what's fundamentally an extractive economy. And in that sense, you can sort of see social reproduction as a sphere that is necessary to make. I mean, it's always been necessary to maintain, but one that is necessary to maintain as a avenue or vector for private profiteering. So when you think about the commodification of things like daycare centers or private equity buying up emergency rooms or whatever else it might be, right? And in that sense, it's not so much a shift from one to the other or a shift of paradigm. We actually have a lot of private enterprise, which is parasitical on the habitation economy. And does that alter, does viewing it that way alter what you're seeing in terms of the challenge to be overcome in realizing a habitation society?
Right. No, I completely agree that private equity buying up medical practices and nursing homes and so forth. I mean, it fits the model that they're following, the model of the large multi-division firm, and it's a completely unproductive and extractive way to organize these services. So, does it change? Um, again, that at the end of the day, the politics of creating democratized habitation is building majoritarian movements that are able to ultimately counter the power of oligarchs and powerful economic interests that are extracting enormous resources from maintaining the status quo, and that remains the fundamental issue that we used to not have a billionaire as a category, that now we've become familiarized to it, and we're waiting for the day that there'll be the first trillionaire. And there's no justification for this. It doesn't make sense. And the proliferation of billionaires has the direct consequence that it makes the rest of us poorer. And we have to use the tools of democratic governance to reverse that.
All right. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Thank you, Fred Block. Please check out the book, The Habitation Society. It offers a way of thinking about where we're going and getting beyond the current crisis that we're in. Habitation Society, right there. Thank you all, and have a good day.